Who's your favorite, like, ancient mythology? Or I guess, what is your favorite ancient mythology?
I honestly don't know enough about ancient mythologies.
Really?
To like, yeah, it's an area that I just like enjoy in like pop culture. Like, you know, like, I don't know, I play Hades, you know, now and then. I'm like, this is fun. I watched Hercules and I was like, that's fun. But like, I really actually haven't learned much about like the myth and lore of that.
So like in middle school, you didn't have like a Greek mythology phase that you went through? Was that just me?
No.
Is that a just me thing?
It was just you. Yeah,
other kids don't do that? That's not a normal thing people do?
No.
Oh, that's disappointing.
I don't know. Maybe.
You're making me realize how weird I am.
You're listening to Dot Femme.
Welcome to Dot Femme. I'm your host, Danielle Gonzalez.
I'm Claire.
And today we're talking about Leslie Feinberg.
We're having a good day.
Yeah. You're in a weird mood today.
Like, I'm just really happy to be like off of work and then like hanging out with my best friend, like recording a podcast about someone that's super cool.
I was going to say, you must have tried a new coffee blend or something.
I did. I've got a nice light roast from Ecuador. Ooh.
Well, like I said, today's episode is about Leslie Feinberg. Before we get into it, I do have a quick disclaimer about pronouns and pronoun usage in this episode. So, Leslie Feinberg wrote about pronouns, quote, "For me, pronouns are always placed within context. I am female-bodied. I am a butch lesbian, a transgender lesbian. Referring to me as she/her is appropriate, particularly in a non-trans setting in which referring to me as he would appear to resolve the social contradiction between my birth, sex, and gender expression and render the transgender expression invisible. I like the gender-neutral pronoun Z here because it makes it impossible to hold on to gender/sex, sexuality assumptions about a person you're about to meet or you've just met. And in an all-trans setting, referring to me as he/him honors my gender expression in the same way that referring to my sister drag queens as she/her does."
Cool.
She's also recorded as saying, "I care which pronoun is used, but people have been respectful to me with the wrong pronoun and disrespectful with the right one. It matters whether someone is using the pronoun as a bigot or if they are trying to demonstrate respect." So.
I'm so glad that she said that.
I agree. All that being said, in this episode, I'm going to attempt to try to refer to Leslie as the way that Z wanted to be referred to. There may be time, because a lot of the research that I did, as I think a lot of trans folks may, recognize or empathize with, a lot of the research I did, they didn't always respect her wishes. So there may be a she/her thrown in here, which, based on what Leslie has written, Z is fine with that. But for the audience, so that it's not too terribly confusing, I will attempt to be using Z/here for them, so that's where we're at. So
this is cool. This is already off to a great start. We're already dealing with like advanced pronouns level 2, baby.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a interesting and slightly different episode than we've done so far, but I think it'll be really good. So I will say, I'm very pleased with what Z wrote about, being respectful with the wrong pronoun and disrespectful with the right one, because I personally, as a trans person, think that it really does matter, the context around,
like
social
what is
interactions.
she talking about?
Yeah, it's so interesting.
Yeah, it can be said in like jest or like bigotry or like in a mocking way. Like I empathize with this as well, because like, I don't know, my gender goes all sorts of which ways, and like when I go play on my sports ball leagues, like I get gendered every which way. I dress like I did when I was in high school, I like put on baggy shorts, baggy clothes, and like, I get buddied, I get like a nice catch man, and I'm like, but I don't worry about like that misgendering. in that way, because it's like, I don't know, people are being respectful. It's like, it's not said in a bigot way. It's like, it's an inclusive way. But, you know, like, it's still, I don't want to be gendered that way.
Yeah.
I don't know. But like, yeah, so I get it. Like, yeah, it's just different. You know?
Yeah, I'm sort of the same way. I also dress how I did in high school.
Hell yeah.
Just, you know, tank tops and jeans. Okay, well, all that being said, disclaimer out of the way. Let's go ahead and jump right in to talk about Leslie Feinberg. So Leslie was born in 1949 in Kansas City, Missouri, to a working class Jewish family. She was raised in Buffalo, New York, always preferred a more masculine style, short hair, jeans, and t-shirts, probably what people would call a classic tomboy. Growing up, she was frequently asked, are you a boy or a girl? You know, I don't know. I've never been particularly androgynous. I think, you know, I was very masculine presenting growing up until I transitioned. And then I'd like to think that I'm very femme presenting. But like I've said, I'm more like, I don't know, I don't throw on a whole lot of makeup and stuff because I'm lazy. But I kind of, I get that, you know, I get what Z must have experienced growing up. Yeah. So I mentioned working class Jewish family. They're like friends and family of the family had faced the horrors of Tsarist Russia in, you know, the early 1900s and also Eastern Europe, like Nazism during World War II. And so, as you know, since the family, a Jewish family, had been exposed to all of that in the past, they were pretty scared of fascism. And this is the 1950s. This is like right in the heart of McCarthyism. And as Z writes, McCarthyism stank like Nazism. So they're, you know, the family's already kind of on edge, worried about what's happening in the country. So unfortunately, oftentimes her parents blamed most of the family's problems on Leslie's, you know, difference. They were terrified that her expression would bring unwanted attention to the family. So around 8 or 9 years old, Leslie began to feel a kinship with Christine Jorgensen, which we're going to do an entire episode on Christine Jorgensen because that's, I think, hopefully, I would assume, maybe I'm wrong, but I would assume most of our listeners at least know who Christine Jorgensen is.
Well, why don't we give our viewers a little snippet? Who is Christine Jorgensen?
Christine Jorgensen was a ex-GI, a veteran of World War II, who traveled to I think Sweden, but it may have been a different country in that area. But I think Sweden, and had a sex change, transitioned to female, and came back very much in the public eye and was kind of a national sensation.
I remember her now.
There's a famous headline, ex-GI becomes blonde bombshell.
Yep.
Yeah, that's Christine Jorgensen.
Yep.
So Leslie had known about Christine Jorgensen. I believe Leslie was about 3 years old when Christine, you know, had her operation and came back and everything. So when she was around 8 or 9 years old, Leslie really started to feel a kinship with Christine and ended up asking her babysitter once, is Christine a boy or a girl? And her babysitter said, Christine isn't anything. She's a freak. So, you know, at 8 or 9 years old, you're hearing people, you know, really kind of start to hit this transphobia pretty hard.
Yeah, sounds like where I grew up.
Yeah, so Leslie started worrying about their own survival, because if Christine is hated for being, you know, kind of in between man and woman, and Leslie is kind of in between man and woman, you know. And
are you about to say that there's drama afoot?
Well, and what I'm trying to say is a 9-year-old shouldn't be worrying about this.
Yeah, maybe. You know, it'd be nice if we could just like exist as we are without like, you know, having to conform to the status quo.
Yeah, so you see that the social consciousness is starting to kind of be developed pretty early on for Leslie. At 14 years old, Leslie starts work at a department store. They began frequenting gay bars in Buffalo, Toronto, and Niagara Falls.
Let's go.
It was really here in this sort of queer environment that Z finally felt that Z weren't alone. So after this, Z primarily worked low-wage temporary jobs, including washing dishes, cleaning cargo ships, and working at a PVC pipe factory. Working at a factory is pretty important for Leslie kind of moving on. He talks a lot about it in the book, which we'll talk about later. But during the early 70s, when Z was in her 20s, they became unemployed as the economic downturn hit, and really struggled. Sounds very familiar, especially for me right now. They were told that they were too masculine of a woman to be hired at a department store or as a secretary. So what Z ended up doing was borrowing a wig from a femme friend and some earrings, and tried to appease society by, looking more feminine, which was not something that Z, preferred or wanted to do.
When I was a kid, they told me that I was too feminine. And now that I'm more feminine, they tell me that I'm too masculine. Can't appease anybody.
No, yeah.
I don't fit with their worldview, And it's like, what I'm trying to draw conclusions to is nothing has changed in the last 50 years, 60 years, 7 years.
Of course
Holy
not.
shit, it's 70 years now.
Yeah. So tried to be perceived as more feminine in order to sort of appease society, but was instead perceived as a trans woman and as a man trying to pass as a woman, and was denied work because of that. So
crazy.
You're really struggling here. So instead, Z tried another experiment, as Z calls them, and spoke with a butch lesbian friend and borrowed some stick-on sideburns to try to pass as a man, and ended up being hired on the spot as a security guard for an art gallery. Crazy. The hoops that Leslie had to jump through just to eke out, a basic survival. So at this time, Leslie's working as a man, passing as a man in, pretty much daily life. Mm-hmm. But as I think any trans person, can empathize with, it's pretty terrifying living in constant fear of being discovered and clocked. So Leslie decided to take male hormones and have top surgery.
Wow.
Not because Leslie identified as a man or a trans man or anything, but just out of sheer survival, just to avoid being discovered and fired.
That's like gender affirming care, but jumping through hoops.
So gender affirming care.
Yeah.
Yeah. This job ends up being very consequential. One night, apparently, Nelson Rockefeller of the Rockefellers, you're familiar with 30 Rock, the address, not the show. The address 30 Rockefeller Plaza, named after this family. Big, industrialist family. So Nelson Rockefeller is scheduled to make an appearance at the art gallery one night. As, especially during the time of the 70s, as we see whenever a controversial public figure makes a public appearance, a protest gathers, and there was a pretty big one gathering outside of the art gallery. After Rockefeller arrives, he's immediately combative to the protesters.
What?
Coming out, yelling at them, flipping them off, all this kind of stuff. And then as he enters the art gallery, where Leslie is the security guard working the door, he's just very dismissive to the middle-class workers like Leslie, completely ignoring them, not even giving them the time of day. To him, they're just set dressing almost. They're only to provide him beverages and open the doors before him. So Leslie's really kind of having this epiphany where Z realized that the middle class was literally caught in the middle. Z writes in her book, why did these families who didn't work in the factories own all of it? It's after this event that Z quit her job and worked as a third shift dishwasher as a diner. And this job as a dishwasher is also very consequential. So while working there, Z asks out a waitress that they work with, and the waitress declines the date. Not for any real reason other than the fact that she's busy that night. She said she's attending a weekly meeting, but no one who works with her knows the details about this meeting. And so
it's in secret.
Leslie just kind of quips a joke. What are you, a communist? And
she said the C word.
The waitress kind of flushes, and a different waitress pulls Leslie into the back, and it's kind of like, what the hell are you trying to do? You're gonna get us fired? Because it turns out they were Marxists.
Oh.
And the weekly meeting they were attending was a communist meeting.
Nice.
So totally didn't intend for any of this to happen. Just kind of, growing up in the age of McCarthyism, as a kid, you hear the word communist a lot. You don't realize what it is. You also, when you're a child growing up in McCarthyism, you don't really understand the gravity of what that, what the Red Scare is really doing. So to you, it just kind of seems like a harmless little, slur, I guess, in whatever way slurs can be harmless, I suppose.
That's fair.
After this interaction, Leslie starts to ask these waitresses some questions about, their sort of political belief system, what communism is, just trying to learn a little bit more about it. And eventually they invite Leslie to a pro-Palestinian demonstration being put on by the members of the Workers' World Party, the WWP.
Nice.
Now, during this time, Leslie is passing as a straight, cis man, has like a bushy beard and whatnot. And so as Zuby gets more involved with the WWP,
Workers' World Party.
Yeah. She's really having a hard time finding her place among the party. After attending International Women's Day celebration in 1973, Z eventually revealed her status as a trans masked woman to the Buffalo chapter organizer or leader.
Awesome.
The chapter leader said that she didn't fully understand it, but, quote, recognized oppression when she hears it.
That's a proper response.
Right. And so after this, Leslie begins studying intersectional oppression, becomes fascinated with the history of oppression and especially gender-based oppression.
Oh, right.
And really starts to ponder the question, have we always existed? We being trans people. Right around this time, I think it was 1973, is when Leslie moves to New York City and begins working as a journalist for the Workers' World Party newspaper called Workers' World. And after 15 years, becomes the managing editor in 1995. Z wrote her first fiction novel in 1993 called Stone Butch Blues. I actually have it sitting right here on the table next to me.
Nice.
It's the next book I'm going to read. I'm looking forward to it. It won the Lambda Literary Awards, and in 1994 it won the award that's now called the Stonewall Book Award. It wasn't called that when the book won it in 94, but and that book is a fiction novel, so it's not an autobiography, but there are really intense parallels to Feinberg's personal experiences as they put it, working class dyke. In 2006, Z releases another novel called Drag King Dreams. In 1992, Z wrote a nonfiction pamphlet called Transgender Liberation, a Movement Whose Time Has Come. And that becomes the basis for the book that is released in 1986 called Transgender Warriors, Making History from Joan of Arc to RuPaul. That's the book that I read. It's a very good book. The book has been re-released multiple times and updated the title each time, including From Joan of Arc to Dennis Rodman, and as it is currently, From Joan of Arc to Marsha P. Johnson and beyond. These two pieces of literature, Transgender Liberation and Transgender Warriors, have helped reshape the current, the modern curriculum of gender studies. Pretty consequential, really important works.
I didn't realize just how many books he wrote. There's a lot here. I want to read some of these nonfiction stuff that they're the nonfiction that they're doing, and
100%.
Just some of them really, I don't know, Stone Butch Blues just seems really cool. And also, this is 1, 2, 3, 4 different books written in the span of 5 years.
3 books and a pamphlet.
Yeah.
3 books and a pamphlet.
So,
the pamphlet's 20 pages, so I wouldn't necessarily call it a book, but 3 books and a pamphlet, yeah.
It's quite a bit of writing. So it was clear that Z was pushing hard during this time in their life.
And that doesn't even touch on the actual journalism articles that Z's been writing for 15 years, for the Workers' World newspaper. So Leslie meets her spouse, Minnie Bruce Pratt, in 1992, who is another kind of anti-racist, anti-class writer. In 2011, they end up getting married. For the remainder of her life, Z continued to write and work on LGBT history and anti-oppression giving speeches and presentations across the country. He described herself as an anti-racist, white, working-class, secular, Jewish, transgender, lesbian, female, revolutionary communist.
Talk about labels.
A lot of labels. In 2014, unfortunately, Leslie ended up passing away from complications due to multiple infections, including Lyme disease. Unfortunately, the nature of being trans, especially being trans before the 2000s, healthcare was hard to come by, and it was very easy for doctors to just refuse to treat you. And so there were significant periods of time where Leslie was, sick and bedridden. And unfortunately, in 2014, it caught up with them. So their final words were, "Remember me as a revolutionary communist." In 2019, he was inducted on the National LGBTQ Wall of Honor within the Stonewall National Monument. He was one of the inaugural 50 American, quote, pioneers, trailblazers, and heroes. So
we're gonna have to go visit. We're gonna have to go visit the National LGBTQ Wall of Honor within the Stonewall National Monument.
I would love to. I would love to do a travel vlog of that. Maybe put it on like Patreon or something.
Yeah, that'd be super cool.
This episode of Dot Femme is supported by our Patreon. Duh. I mean, come on. You think a tiny trans podcast like us would have sponsors? I wish. No, we're supported entirely by our listeners. We're kind of like PBS that way, only queerer. Patreon.com/dotfemme. That's patreon.com/dotfemme.
So we talked a little bit about this book, Transgender Warriors, which I described as probably Leslie's magnum opus. I don't know if that's how Leslie would describe it, but I do. So what is this, what is the work that she's really, we talked about her life, but like, what is the work she's really done? Well, I think that there are four main points that I think Leslie really kind of explores and hammers home. And the first one is that trans recognition is ancient. In the research, he's discovering that before the rise of like the patriarchy with a capital P, society was kind of broken into much smaller matrilineal cooperative communities, and that seemed to be very normal.
Oh yeah.
And in these ancient communities, gender separation was way less rigid because survival was a cooperative effort, right?
Yeah.
Some males, we should say, worked with the women in the community and were considered women, and some females worked with the men in the community and were considered men. It was much more kind of fluid than we see today. And oftentimes these trans identities were revered as sacred or spiritual. A lot of ancient gods and goddesses were portrayed as trans or intersex in some way. And because of this, a lot of priestesses of these deities were trans women who, underwent like ritual sex change and, it's really interesting kind of history. There was a very prevalent deity around this time called the Great Mother. What we find about the Great Mother is that while today the Great Mother is kind of referred to as a female deity, there's a lot of evidence that shows that at one point the Great Mother was kind of an intersex deity and was depicted as being both male and female, in sort of a way. And I think a lot of that tradition around the Great Mother filters down into later deities that we see in, subsequent civilizations, including Dionysus.
Interesting.
Dionysus was at one point depicted as intersex, which I think is very interesting. The next point that Leslie, talks about is a new question that has sort of come up in all of this research. Why did bigotry begin? Leslie begins trying to answer this question by looking for some of the earliest laws against cross-dressing and transgender identity.
Oh, interesting.
And some of the earliest edicts are found in the book of Deuteronomy of the Bible.
Yeah.
So to kind of explore this, we need to know a little bit about the history of the Hebrews and a little bit about the history of the Bible.
Take us back, Dany. Take us back.
Grown, I know, Bible, but this is important. This is important history. So the Hebrews were a group of nomadic cattle herding tribes who migrated to, conquered, and settled in the Fertile Crescent around 1500 BCE. And the area that they ended up in was kind of a crossroads of trade routes that allowed these peoples, the Hebrews and surrounding tribes, to really begin to build this economy and start to accumulate wealth. Now, this accumulation of wealth begins real small. I'm talking like simply collecting slightly more food than you need for one season, just in case that there's a potential difficult harvest in the future, right? And it was usually the men who were primarily, but again, remember, not exclusively, the wild game hunters. So they were kind of responsible for stockpiling this abundance. But as this wealth begins to accumulate more and more, it eventually becomes more than any one person could consume or utilize in a single lifetime. So there becomes a need to pass on what's left as an inheritance, right? But then who are we passing it on to? So it's around this time that this matrilineal cooperative system starts to slowly shift into a patrilineal system based on the consolidation of wealth and power. As this wealth and power become increasingly concentrated, the small group in power has to start considering the question of, well, how do we defend our power from a larger majority? And the answer is the same back then as it is today. Divide and conquer. You get people fighting against each other so they can't organize against you, right? In order to affect this, laws, and especially religious laws, like those in the book of Deuteronomy, are passed or written or whatever to begin to support this patrilineal consolidation of power. Now, remember, during this time, ritual sex change, transgender identities, cross-dressing, these are sacred paths for priestesses and worshippers of these matrilineal traditions and intersex goddesses. And so women and transgender identities pose a threat to this emerging patrilineal rule, right? Because if the men are the ones owning the wealth and they're passing it down to their male progeny, their sons, then anyone that blurs the line between what is a man and a woman can threaten the idea of who is allowed to own things. So this, the process of this burgeoning social divide between men and women and those who blur the line is one that we see taking place all over the world in ancient civilizations around the same time. And by the same time, I don't necessarily mean the same year, but the same time period in their social development, if that makes sense. So we start to see how this idea of challenging gender is sort of a proletariat idea, right? And that leads to Leslie's next point, which is that trans revolution is peasant revolution. There's a shocking number of peasant revolutions occurring throughout the Middle Ages and Industrial Revolution that were led by people who were, quote, transing gender, right? Ooh. Like folks who were cross-dressing or folks who were genuinely trans. I didn't know a lot of this, and I'm sure there's so many. I'm sure we could do an entire episode on peasant revolutions, and I'm sure we will.
Yeah, probably.
Here's a really good example that I think most people know the basics of, but probably not a lot of the details. Joan of Arc, right? Now, I grew up Catholic and went to Catholic school my whole life. Now, I'm not religious per se now, but I learned a little bit about Joan of Arc growing up because she's a Catholic saint. What I didn't know was that she got embroiled in the medieval Inquisition. So Joan of Arc, for anyone who isn't familiar, Joan of Arc was a young, I think she was 17 years old when she, first got started. So she was a young French, I guess, girl. I mean, we don't really know how Joan of Arc identified per se.
Yeah.
But Joan of Arc, young French person. And they ended up leading a peasant rebellion against the marauding English who were just kind of plundering France at the time and really kind of making life hell for the French peasants.
Hell yeah, Joan.
Joan ended up being seen as a folk hero and kind of this righteous warrior. Mm-hmm. Joan talked a lot about how her mission was a gift was a given to her by God to lead the common people against the English, to drive them out of their homeland, stuff like that. What she also talks about is that part of her mission from God was also to wear men's clothing. And she ended up being burned at the stake in the late 1400s when she was 19 years old, mostly because she refused to stop wearing men's clothing. And that was apparently a crime against God at the time.
Yeah.
That's just one example. There's many other peasant revolutions, Rebecca and her daughters, the White Boys of Ireland. Like I said, I'm sure we'll do an episode about this.
We've been here forever, and people have tried to oppress us forever.
Well, it's not so much that as it is we've been here forever and we've constantly been fighting. This concept of like trans, revolution, fighting for trans rights, it's broader than that. It's not just trans rights. It's workers' rights. It's, race rights, just human rights. So
It's that simple.
the final question that Leslie poses is, what is a woman?
I gotta go. I have to, this one might be a little controversial here. I just want to like brace you, like
I don't think so.
I don't know.
I think it sounds a lot more controversial because we're so like, especially, folks in our generation are so programmed against that question because the people that tend to be asking that questions are like Steven Crowder and J.K. Rowling.
Right. It's so fucking just makes me so angry. Anyway, yes, I hate that damn question. They're like, what is a woman? And they're like, it's a gotcha question.
Leslie begins to ask the question, what is a woman? Or more specifically, how do we define woman, right? So safe spaces for oppressed groups are important. And, for women specifically, due to the constant harassment and threats of danger in day-to-day life, there is a real need for safe spaces and clear allies. But how rigid should those borders be, right? Because you can't just divide it straight down the middle. If men are enemies and women are allies, well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because what about men who fought for women's liberation, like John Brown? Is he not an ally? What about women who fought against women's liberation, like Margaret Thatcher or Marjorie Taylor Greene? I know I'm getting political.
Oh boy. Like I said, I gotta go.
But are they allies? Because I personally would say that they're not. And what about like intersex people? Do you just divide them halfway down their body? Like, so there is a need for clear allies, but where do you make that line, right? Do we define woman based on biological determinism, that women are born women and have vaginas? Do we base the definition on women on common experience, that, women experience societal oppression and whatnot? Leslie rejects a definition based on both of these because either definition will invariably exclude some women. Not everyone is biologically identical, and not everyone shares the same experiences.
Yeah, of course.
There are plenty of women who are, born infertile. And so if your definition of woman is someone who can carry a child, there are a lot of women who can't do that. Should they be excluded? I don't think so. Similarly, do we define woman based on a common oppression? And if so, what kind of oppression? Socialist and materialist oppression, psychological or physical oppression? Because women aren't the only ones who go through these things. Women aren't the only ones who are paid less for their work in society. Women aren't the only ones who experience rape or battery. So if we define woman by shared oppression, you're still going to be excluding certain people. And if you define it by shared oppression, how long do you need to experience that depression before you're considered one of the girls, right? So gender doesn't come in just these two flavors. Furthermore, the expression of gender is going to differ depending on races, nationalities, regions, classes.
Right.
For example, the masculinity of a KKK member is going to look very different from the masculinity of an African American man, right? So how do you define woman? I'm asking you, Claire, how do you define woman?
I don't know. If I identify as a woman and my body aligns with a woman, that's how I don't know. I just respect people's right to what they want to be called, how they want to self-express, how they want to self-identify, if
Self-determination.
yeah, self-determination.
Yeah.
That's my vibe,
Yeah, no, it is a complicated question. I understand why people, especially now, are asking this question, but I think Leslie makes a really good point that any kind of hard definition, no matter what definition you use, there will always be people who are excluded.
Like it's literally just about respect, right? Like if you want to be called female, then you should, you have the right to be called female. If you want to identify as a woman, you have the right to identify as a woman. Gender is, social. It is not biological. And, I think the more that we start to try to, police it or create these, invisible lines and try to put people in boxes, just like the further back we get as a society, we don't progress, and like we've seen this, you were talking earlier about it in the episode where, like we had these tribal types, groups, who had revered trans people because like trans people went against the binary. They went against what, it's the third option, right? It's the third way of looking at things. We have, we cannot decide if we are both butting heads. There needs to be a third mediator or moderator to move things forward and progress things forward. I think the more we just start to find respect among different, ideas and groups and, find ways to deliberate over ideas in healthy conversation, the stronger we become as a society. But I hope I've made my point eloquently. But this whole thing, it's like you ask any trans person, and it's a whole other conversation. So
language is a tool to effectively communicate ideas, right? And to that end, words mean things, and those definitions need to be more or less enforced, because if you don't enforce definitions, then words cease all meaning and communication becomes muddy, right? To use an analogy, a lot of people are really pissed even today that Pluto is not a planet anymore.
I know. It still is a planet in my heart.
Okay, but it's not a planet. It is a planetoid.
Yeah, I know.
Because
it's so cute.
As we learned more about the world around us, there became a need to further define more specifically what a planet is. And Pluto didn't fit that category. So they made a new category for it. And we're finding a lot more objects that are similar to Pluto in that category than Pluto is to planets. And so...
Right. And so that's what I'm saying. Like, if we start policing, what is a woman, if we start like setting these lines, then we don't have...
All I'm saying is that there is obviously a need to define woman, and if we choose a definition, it needs to be enforced in some way, which is why we need to be extremely careful about what definition we use and how rigid we make it. And that's what Leslie is saying too.
Let me put it in a different way then. Right here and now, at this point in history, defining woman would be to our detriment. I think that any sort of definition of woman or man would go against the systematic oppression that we are experiencing at scale. Because any type of definition that we try to associate with trans people, with what is a woman, with what is a man, is going to be used against us. And it's especially at this point in our history, like, this definition, it's testing the water, it's a hot surface. And if anything goes on it, it's going to boil. I think it's a really dangerous thing at this point in history to define woman. And I think that like this trans liberation that we're experiencing is what is required in order for us to get to the point of the definition of woman, the definition of transgender, the definition of man. Like, I think, we need to find a point in our history where we have it to some degree, full acceptance, full societal acceptance, respect, liberation. And then, and only then, when we have equal rights, when we have these things, that's when women can be defined. Otherwise, it's a barrier that exists that we have to push back against again and again and again, because the definition of woman is always changing. The definition of man is always changing.
See, I don't think it's that linear. I think you're going to have to define woman as part of that process. You can't wait for the process to happen first, because it's like you can't fight something that you can't see, right? You have to know, you have to be able to know and look at what it is you're fighting, right? There needs to be an awareness there. And I think that in order to really talk about trans liberation, you're going to have language in place, and that language is going to require a definition for man and a definition for woman. Because how do you talk about the people that are pushing those boundaries if you can't talk about the boundaries?
I like your point about you have, in order to push against something, there has to be a clear rule established. And I'm just like, yeah, I think that's an eloquent point. I agree with you there. I just think it's really dangerous to be applying a definition at this point in time.
Well, I think that fighting against a patrilineal social system that has existed for 4,000 years is going to be inherently dangerous regardless of whether a definition is defined. But defining a definition is going to end up being a very valuable tool in our toolkit, because otherwise, I think without having clear language that we can fall back on, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. And I think that's what Leslie was talking about too, is that there is a need to define woman because, like we said before, safe spaces for oppressed groups are important, and there is a need for those spaces and clear allies. The question is, what definitions do we use to secure those spaces and identify those allies? And if we don't have those definitions, how can we ever identify the people that will help us and have safe refuge that we can return to when we need to during the fight, right?
Yeah.
The point I'm trying to make, and the point that Leslie is trying to make, is that there is a need to define woman, but we need to be very careful about how we do it. And that definition is not going to be a very clear cut line, right?
I think it's self-identified, and
I think it's self-identified too.
Yeah. I think it's really important. And, I don't think anyone else should put those rules on us. And I think that it's up to the individual to self-identify and, learn and understand privilege and intersectionality on their own, to determine how best to identify in their daily life, and determine whether or not and when they should be identified as transgender, as man, as woman.
I think this is me personally, but I would be shocked if Leslie didn't also agree with this statement. But I think, and especially now, I think we're so focused on our own individual fights that we're having a hard time seeing how it's all the same fight. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
I think that, the trans community is so busy focused on how do we make trans people accepted, and the black community is how do we get institutional racism and policing to stop? And, the pro-Palestinian movement is how do we get, you see what I'm saying? But at the end of the day, it's all the same fight, because we're being divided specifically so that we cannot stand together.
Are you talking about a class war, Dany?
Yeah, I'm talking about class consciousness.
Oh.
That's the whole thesis of Leslie's life. I want to end this episode with a passage from the book Transgender Warriors, which, we've been talking a lot about, and I mentioned that I read the whole thing and I really liked it. I have not yet recommended this book to everyone, and I want to do that now. I think everyone needs to go get this book and read it. I think it's very important in recognizing and understanding our common struggle across social divides, like we were just talking about. And I want to finish this episode by reading a final passage from the book. This is part of the afterword. It was written September 1st, 1996, and I'm going to try and get through this passage without tearing up. As you are reading this page, I might still be very ill. Perhaps I was not able to travel to your small town or big city to read to you from this book and to discover more about all that connects us. It is my loss. But I send this book to you. I am not physically strong enough as a human being, even while healthy, to put transgender warriors in the hands of each person I want to read it. But I have confidence in you as an organizer. If, as you read this book, its ideas resonate as truth, then I know that you will pass it on to a friend, a family member, a coworker, or a neighbor, or a podcast audience.
A podcast, yep.
I am one of many trans voices that are shattering the silence of centuries. We are the harbinger of a mass movement that demands fundamental change. Transgender Warriors is my voice, my contribution to that movement. This is the work I could produce with my individual strength. I am heartened by my belief that you will lift my work to new heights.
Ooh, yeah, that was pretty deep, Dany.
Yeah. This is supposed to be like a fun and uplifting history podcast.
It is. Anyway, viewer, thanks for listening. We really appreciate you. You can find us on Patreon and enjoy this uncut episode fully for your listening pleasure. I'm Claire.
I was just going to let you do the whole outro.
Oh, you're Dany.
Thank you for listening to Dot Femme. Like Claire said, if you like what we do here, you can find us on our website. You can find us on Blue Sky. You can support us on Patreon. And with that, we'll see you in 2 weeks. So
That's it. Oh, I'll see you next time.
Bye.